The rain hammered down on the cracked sidewalk outside Meridian Financial Tower, turning the October evening into a blur of neon reflections and rushing umbrellas. In the chaos of another brutal New York downpour, nobody noticed the small black device that tumbled from a designer briefcase and skittered across the wet pavement toward the subway grating. Nobody except Marcus Rivera, who sat huddled under a torn piece of cardboard near the building's entrance, watching the expensive phone slide directly into his weathered hands like fate had personally delivered it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus had been invisible to the world for so long that most people looked right through him. 3 tours in Afghanistan had left him with scars that ran deeper than the jagged line across his left cheek, and when he'd returned home to find his apartment gone and his job filled, the streets had become his reluctant refuge. Now, 18 months later, he'd learned to read the rhythm of the city's heartbeat from his corner spot outside one of Manhattan's most prestigious office buildings. He knew which executives always carried cash, which ones avoided eye contact entirely, and which ones, like the woman who'd just lost her phone, moved through the world with the kind of focused intensity that suggested their entire empire could crumble with a single missed call. Victoria Chen had been sprinting toward the subway when the contents of her briefcase decided to stage their own rebellion. Papers scattered like confetti, her laptop case burst open, and somewhere in the chaos her phone had vanished. She stood in the middle of the sidewalk, rain soaking through her charcoal suit, frantically patting down every pocket, while commuters flowed around her like water around a stone. The phone contained more than just her contacts and emails. It held the final negotiations for the Morrison Healthcare acquisition, a deal worth $400 million that was supposed to close in exactly 6 hours. Without those files, without access to the secure app that contained the signing codes, the biggest merger in her company's history would collapse before dawn. Marcus studied the device in his hands, its sleek surface already fogging with condensation. The screen kept lighting up with incoming calls, each notification accompanied by a urgent buzz that seemed to grow more desperate with each passing minute. He could see fragments of text messages appearing, words like, quote, urgent, board meeting, and Morrison deal, flashing across the display. Most people in his situation would have simply pocketed the phone and disappeared into the urban maze, but Marcus had learned something during his time in the service that the streets hadn't managed to strip away yet. Sometimes doing the right thing was the only thing that separated you from becoming the very chaos you were trying to survive. He pushed himself up from his makeshift shelter, ignoring the way his left knee protested after hours of sitting on cold concrete. The woman was still there, now on her hands and knees searching through the puddles, her perfectly styled black hair hanging in wet strands around her face. She looked nothing like the polished executive who'd walked past him countless times before, and everything like someone whose world was quietly falling apart one phone call at a time. "Excuse me," Marcus called out, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I think this might be yours." Victoria's head snapped up, her dark eyes focusing on the man approaching her with careful, measured steps. She'd seen him before, sitting by the entrance, but like everyone else, she'd trained herself to look past the torn military jacket and the cardboard sign that read, "Veteran. Anything helps. God bless." Now, seeing him up close, she noticed details that her rushed lifestyle had always glossed over. The way he held himself with perfect posture despite his circumstances. The intelligence in his brown eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. The gentle way he extended her phone, as if he understood exactly how precious it was. "Oh my God," she breathed, reaching for the device with trembling fingers. "I thought I'd lost everything." Marcus watched her face transform as she powered on the screen, relief flooding her features like sunrise after the longest night. She was younger than he'd initially thought, probably early 30s. With the kind of sharp elegance that came from years of fighting for respect in rooms full of men who'd inherited their seats at the table. But there was something else there too, something vulnerable and human that her professional armor couldn't quite conceal. "The Morrison deal," she muttered, scrolling through her notifications. "It's still here. Everything's still here." She looked up at him, and for the first time in months, Marcus felt like someone was actually seeing him. "I'm Victoria. Victoria Chen. And you just saved my entire company." "Marcus Rivera," he replied simply. "Glad I could help." Victoria clutched the phone against her chest, her mind already racing through the implications of what had just happened. This man, this homeless veteran who society had written off as invisible, had just preserved a deal that would secure jobs for thousands of employees and establish her company as a major player in the healthcare industry. While she'd been panicking in the rain, he'd been the calm center of a storm that could have destroyed everything she'd worked for. "I need to do something," she said suddenly. "To thank you. This deal? It's worth millions of dollars, and without this phone." She trailed off, realizing how inadequate words seemed in the face of what he'd just done. Marcus shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, just someone helping someone else." But Victoria wasn't the type of person who accepted simple answers to complex situations. She studied his face, noting the way his eyes seemed to hold stories he'd never tell, the precise way he spoke that suggested education and experience far beyond what his current circumstances might indicate. There was a mystery here, a depth that intrigued her professional instincts and touched something deeper in her heart. "At least let me buy you dinner," she insisted. "There's a diner around the corner. It's the least I can do." Marcus hesitated. He'd learned to be suspicious of charity, of the way some people used kindness as a weapon to make themselves feel better about looking the other way. But something in Victoria's expression told him this wasn't about assuaging guilt or earning karma points. This was about recognition, about one person acknowledging another's humanity in a world that had forgotten how to see. "All right," he said finally. "But only if you let me tell you about the Morrison Healthcare acquisition while we eat. I've been reading about it in the business sections people throw away, and I think you're making a mistake." Victoria's eyebrows shot up. This homeless veteran had been following her company's biggest deal? "What kind of mistake?" Marcus smiled, and for the first time in months, it reached his eyes. "The kind that could cost you more than just money, but that's a conversation for somewhere warm and dry." The diner Marcus led her to was nothing like the upscale restaurants where Victoria usually conducted business. Chrome stools lined a worn counter, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the smell of coffee and grilled onions hung thick in the air. It was the kind of place where truckers and night shift workers fueled up on dreams and caffeine, where nobody cared about your stock portfolio or your last quarterly earnings report. It was perfect. They slid into a red vinyl booth near the window, and Victoria found herself studying Marcus as he ordered coffee and a simple sandwich with the careful economy of someone who'd learned to make every dollar count. She noticed the way he thanked the waitress by name, how he seemed to know half the people in the restaurant, the respect in their eyes when they nodded his way. This wasn't just any homeless veteran, this was someone who'd... Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Built relationships. Someone who'd maintained his dignity and humanity, despite circumstances that would have broken most people. "So," Victoria said, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug for warmth, "tell me about this mistake I'm supposedly making." Marcus pulled a folded newspaper from his jacket pocket, its pages soft with wear and marked with careful annotations in the margins. "Morrison Healthcare," he began, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone who'd spent years analyzing complex situations under pressure. "Great acquisition target on paper, solid revenue streams, established patient base, good geographic coverage, but you're missing something crucial." He spread the paper on the table, pointing to a small article tucked away in the business section. 3 months ago, Morrison quietly settled a class action lawsuit about patient data breaches. The settlement was sealed, but the legal fees alone suggest it was substantial. More importantly, the underlying security infrastructure issues that caused the breach were never fully addressed. Victoria leaned forward, her business instincts fully engaged. "How do you know that?" "Because I've been where Morrison is right now," Marcus replied. "Not in healthcare, but in the military. When you're responsible for protecting sensitive information, and you cut corners on security to save money, those corners always come back to cut you. Morrison's IT infrastructure is built on legacy systems that are maybe 5 years away from being completely obsolete. You acquire them now, and in 2 years you'll be spending twice what you paid to completely rebuild their entire digital backbone." Victoria stared at him, her mind racing through the implications. Her due diligence team had focused on revenue projections and market share analysis, but cybersecurity infrastructure wasn't sexy enough to warrant the same attention. If Marcus was right, if Morrison was sitting on a ticking time bomb of outdated security protocols and vulnerable patient data, the acquisition could turn from a triumph into a catastrophe. "You said you've been where Morrison is now," she said carefully. "What did you do before?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "Army intelligence, specialized in cybersecurity and infrastructure protection. Did 3 tours in Afghanistan. Came home to find that the private sector wasn't particularly interested in hiring veterans with PTSD and a tendency to ask uncomfortable questions about security protocols." The pieces began falling into place for Victoria. The way he analyzed information, the precision of his language, the depth of his insights into corporate vulnerabilities. This wasn't just a homeless veteran who'd gotten lucky with a dropped phone. This was a highly trained professional who'd been failed by the very system he'd served to protect. "What happened?" she asked softly. Marcus shrugged, but Victoria could see the pain he was trying to hide. "Got back from my 3rd deployment in 2019. Had some issues adjusting, some problems sleeping, some problems with crowds and loud noises. Nothing I couldn't handle, but employers tend to see PTSD on a veteran's file, and suddenly they're concerned about liability and workplace safety. Went through my savings trying to find work, lost my apartment, and discovered that sleeping rough is actually easier than trying to explain to potential employers why a decorated intelligence officer can't seem to hold down a civilian job." Victoria felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went beyond sympathy or pity. She thought about her own struggles to be taken seriously in a male-dominated industry, the way people had dismissed her ideas until she'd proven herself a dozen times over. But even at her lowest points, she'd never faced the systemic abandonment that had led Marcus to the streets. "The Morrison deal," she said suddenly. "If you're right about the security issues, what would you recommend?" Marcus's eyes lit up with the kind of intensity Victoria recognized in herself when she was working on a problem that mattered. "Delay the acquisition for 60 days. Hire an independent cybersecurity firm to do a complete infrastructure audit. Make the results a condition of the final agreement. If Morrison's systems are as vulnerable as I suspect, either negotiate a significantly lower purchase price to account for the necessary upgrades, or walk away entirely." Victoria pulled out her phone, the same device Marcus had returned to her just an hour earlier, and began making notes. "An independent audit would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The board won't approve that kind of expense without solid justification." "Then let me do a preliminary assessment," Marcus said quietly. "Give me access to Morrison's publicly available information, their annual reports, their SEC filings, their vendor contracts that are part of the public record. I can build you a risk assessment that will either confirm your current timeline or give you enough ammunition to convince the board that a deeper audit is necessary." Victoria looked across the table at this man who'd gone from returning her lost phone to potentially saving her company from a catastrophic mistake, all in the span of a single conversation. "Why would you do that?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the window where the rain had finally stopped and the city was beginning to gleam under the streetlights. "Because I've spent the last 18 months feeling like everything I learned, everything I trained for, everything I sacrificed for this country was worthless. Because maybe helping you helps me remember that I'm still useful for something other than keeping a piece of sidewalk warm." Victoria felt her throat tighten. She'd built her career on reading people, on identifying talent and potential in unexpected places. But she'd never encountered anyone quite like Marcus Rivera, someone whose expertise had been rendered invisible by circumstances beyond his control, someone whose value had been overlooked by a society that measured worth in paychecks and permanent addresses. "Where would you do this work?" she asked. "I mean, where would you have access to computers and internet?" Marcus smiled, and Victoria caught a glimpse of the confident professional he must have been before the system failed him. "The public library has excellent computer access, and the VA Center downtown has Wi-Fi and quiet spaces for veterans. I've been keeping up with cybersecurity developments there anyway. It's amazing how much you can learn when you have nothing but time and the motivation to stay relevant." Victoria made a decision that would have seemed impossible to her just hours earlier. What if I told you I had something better than the library? My company has a 24-hour office space with secure internet access and everything you'd need to do this kind of analysis properly. Interested? Marcus studied her face, looking for the catch, the hidden agenda, the inevitable disappointment that came when people made promises they had no intention of keeping. But Victoria's expression was serious, professional, and completely sincere. "You're offering me access to your office to analyze a deal that could make or break your company," he said slowly. "Based on a 30-minute conversation in a diner. I'm offering you the chance to prove that your skills are still valuable," Victoria corrected. "Based on the fact that you've already demonstrated better business instincts in 30 minutes than my entire due diligence team showed in 6 months. Marcus extended his hand across the table. "Then I guess we have a deal." Victoria shook his hand, surprised by the strength and steadiness of his grip. "We have a deal." What neither of them realized was that their conversation had been overheard by someone whose opinion would soon matter more than either of them could have imagined. At the counter, nursing a cup of coffee and pretending to read a paperback novel, sat Elena Rodriguez, a woman whose unassuming appearance concealed one of the sharpest minds in corporate America. Elena was the executive nanny who'd built her reputation on managing the personal and professional lives of Fortune 500 CEOs, the person wealthy executives trusted with their children, their schedules, and their most sensitive business decisions. Elena worked for Harrison Morrison, the founder and CEO of Morrison Healthcare, the very company Victoria was trying to acquire. She'd been in the diner by chance, escaping from the endless stream of phone calls and crisis management that came with caring for Harrison's twin 8-year-old daughters, while their father navigated the stress of selling the company he'd built from nothing. As she listened to Victoria and Marcus discuss security vulnerabilities and infrastructure audits, Elena's blood ran cold. Everything Marcus had said about Morrison Healthcare was true. The data breaches, the outdated systems, the liability issues that Harrison had been desperately trying to hide from potential buyers. Elena knew because she'd been the one managing Harrison's schedule when the cybersecurity consultants delivered their devastating assessment 6 months earlier. She'd been the one arranging the legal meetings, scheduling the sealed settlement negotiations, coordinating the damage control efforts that had barely kept the company afloat. Elena also knew something that neither Victoria nor Marcus could have discovered through public records. Harrison Morrison was dying. The stress of building his company while raising his daughters as a single father had taken its toll, and the recent diagnosis of aggressive pancreatic cancer had given him perhaps 6 months to live. The sale to Victoria's company wasn't just about maximizing shareholder value. It was about ensuring that his life's work would continue, and that his daughters would be financially secure after he was gone. If Victoria Chen delayed the acquisition for additional audits, if she discovered the true extent of Morrison Healthcare's vulnerabilities, she would either walk away from the deal entirely or negotiate a price so low that Harrison's daughters would inherit a fraction of what their father had intended to leave them. Elena couldn't let that happen. Those girls had already lost their mother to a car accident 3 years earlier. They couldn't lose their father's legacy too. Elena finished her coffee, left money on the counter, and walked out into the cold October night, with a decision crystallizing in her mind. She had access to information that could destroy Victoria Chen's acquisition plans, connections that could expose Marcus Rivera's military background in ways that might undermine his credibility, and the kind of influence in corporate circles that could turn a promising partnership into a professional disaster. But she also had something else, a conscience that had been shaped by 20 years of caring for other people's children, of watching families navigate crises and triumphs, of understanding that sometimes the right choice and the profitable choice weren't the same thing. As she walked back toward Harrison Morrison's penthouse apartment, where 2 little girls were probably supposed to be asleep, but were more likely reading under their covers with flashlights, Elena began formulating a plan that would change everyone's life in ways none of them could have anticipated. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made October in New York feel like a rehearsal for winter. Victoria Chen stood in her office on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Financial Tower, looking down at the street corner where she'd first encountered Marcus Rivera less than 12 hours earlier. The cardboard shelter was gone, but she could still see the exact spot where her phone had slipped from her briefcase and into the hands of someone who'd turned out to be far more than he'd initially appeared. Marcus arrived at the building at exactly 8 o'clock, wearing the same worn military jacket but carrying himself with the purposeful stride of someone who had a job to do. Victoria had arranged for him to have temporary access to one of the company's smaller conference rooms, complete with high-speed internet, secure terminals, and access to the financial databases he'd need to conduct his preliminary assessment of Morrison Healthcare. She watched through the glass partition as he settled into the workspace, his movements economical and precise. Within minutes, he'd organized his materials, established his research methodology, and begun the systematic analysis that would either validate her acquisition timeline or potentially save her company from a $400 million mistake. Victoria was just about to check on his progress when her assistant knocked on her office door. "Ms. Chen, there's someone here to see you. She says it's about the Morrison Healthcare acquisition, and she claims to have information you need to hear before you proceed with the deal." Victoria's stomach tightened. News of the acquisition was supposed to be confidential until after the signing, carefully managed to prevent market speculation or interference from competitors. If someone outside her inner circle knew enough details to show up at her office making claims about inside information, it meant either her security protocols had been compromised or someone was playing a much deeper game than she'd realized. "Send her in," Victoria said, moving behind her desk and adopting the kind of composed, professional demeanor that had served her well in countless high-stakes negotiations. The woman who entered her office was perhaps 50 years old, with graying brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and the kind of understated elegance that suggested confidence without ostentation. She wore a navy blazer over dark jeans, carried a worn leather briefcase, and moved with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being the most competent person in any room. "Miss Chen," the woman said, extending her hand, "my name is Elena Rodriguez. I work for Harrison Morrison, and I believe we need to talk." Victoria's mind immediately began calculating possibilities and risks. Elena Rodriguez wasn't a name that had appeared on any of the organizational charts her team had analyzed, which meant she was either someone Morrison had deliberately kept hidden from the due diligence process, or someone whose role was significant enough to warrant personal secrecy. "Please, have a seat," Victoria said, gesturing toward the chairs in front of her desk. "What kind of work do you do for Mr. Morrison?" Elena settled into the chair with the comfortable ease of someone who'd spent years navigating delicate conversations in powerful people's offices. "I'm what you might call an executive nanny," she said with a slight smile. "I manage Mr. Morrison's personal schedule, coordinate his family obligations, and occasionally handle sensitive matters that require discretion and trust." Victoria nodded, though she was still unclear about why someone in Elena's position would have information relevant to a corporate acquisition. "And you have something to tell me about the Morrison Healthcare deal?" Elena opened her briefcase and withdrew a manila folder, placing it carefully on Victoria's desk. "Yesterday evening, I happened to overhear a conversation between you and a gentleman named Marcus Rivera. You were discussing potential security vulnerabilities in Morrison Healthcare's infrastructure, and Mr. Rivera was offering to conduct a preliminary assessment that might delay or derail your acquisition timeline." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. If Elena had been listening to their conversation at the diner, she had access to information that could compromise not just the acquisition, but Marcus's involvement in it. "I'm not sure what you think you heard, but—" Elena held up her hand gently. "Ms. Chen, I'm not here to threaten you or to interfere with your business decisions. But I am here to give you information that I believe you need to make those decisions with a complete understanding of the situation." She opened the folder and withdrew a medical report with Harrison Morrison's name at the top. 6 months ago, Mr. Morrison was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. His prognosis is 6 months, possibly less, if the treatments don't respond as hoped. He hasn't shared this information with his board of directors, his business partners, or anyone outside his immediate family and medical team. Victoria stared at the document, her mind racing through the implications. If Morrison's CEO was terminally ill, if his company was operating under the direction of someone who might not survive to see the acquisition completed, it introduced variables that her team hadn't even considered. "He's selling the company," Elena continued, "not because he wants to maximize shareholder value or because he believes it's the optimal strategic moment. He's selling because he wants to ensure that his 2 daughters are financially secure and that the company he built survives his passing under leadership that can take it into the future." Victoria looked up from the medical report. "Why are you telling me this?" Elena's expression softened, and Victoria caught a glimpse of the genuine care and concern that had probably made her invaluable to the Morrison family. Because Mr. Rivera was right about the security vulnerabilities. Morrison Healthcare is sitting on infrastructure problems that will require massive investment to resolve. Harrison knows this, but he's been hoping to complete the sale before buyers discover the full extent of the issues. Victoria set the medical report aside, her business instincts warring with the unexpected emotional complexity of the situation. "So you're warning me away from a deal that would benefit your employer?" "I'm giving you information that will help you make the best decision for everyone involved," Elena corrected. "Including Harrison's daughters, who deserve to inherit something substantial from their father's life's work, and your company, which deserves to know exactly what it's acquiring." Elena reached into her briefcase again and withdrew a second folder. "These are the complete cybersecurity assessment reports that Harrison commissioned 6 months ago. The sealed legal settlements, the infrastructure audit findings, the projected costs for system upgrades. Everything Mr. Rivera suspected and more." Victoria opened the second folder, scanning through technical reports and financial projections that confirmed Marcus's instincts had been not just accurate, but conservative. The security vulnerabilities were worse than he'd suggested, and the cost to address them would be staggering. "This information would give me significant leverage to renegotiate the acquisition price," Victoria said slowly, "potentially saving my company millions of dollars while reducing what Morrison's daughters would inherit." Elena nodded. "That's exactly right." Victoria looked across her desk at this woman who'd walked into her office with enough inside information to dramatically alter the trajectory of the biggest deal in her company's history. "So what are you proposing?" Elena leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the tone of someone who'd spent years finding creative solutions to impossible problems. "I'm proposing that you hire Marcus Rivera as a cybersecurity consultant, not just for this preliminary assessment, but as a permanent member of your team. Pay him a salary that reflects his actual expertise, not his current circumstances. Then structure the Morrison acquisition as a partnership rather than a simple purchase." Victoria frowned. "What kind of partnership?" "Morrison Healthcare becomes a subsidiary of your company, but Harrison retains a minority ownership stake that passes to his daughters upon his death. You assume responsibility for the infrastructure upgrades, but you spread the costs over 5 years instead of absorbing them immediately. Harrison gets to see his company stabilized before he passes, his daughters inherit a stake in a thriving enterprise rather than a lump sum payout, and you acquire a healthcare company without the crushing financial burden of immediate system overhauls." Victoria stared at Elena, recognizing the elegance of a solution that turned a potential disaster into a mutually beneficial arrangement. "And Marcus Rivera fits into this how?" Elena smiled. "Mr. Rivera becomes your Director of Cybersecurity Integration, responsible for overseeing the infrastructure improvements at Morrison Healthcare and ensuring that your own company's systems are protected against similar vulnerabilities. It's work he's uniquely qualified to do, and it gives him the chance to rebuild his career while contributing to something meaningful." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of Elena's proposal. It was brilliant, complex, and completely different from the straightforward acquisition she'd originally planned. It was also risky, requiring her to trust people she'd known for less than 24 hours and to restructure a deal that had taken months to negotiate. "Why do you care what happens to Marcus Rivera?" Victoria asked. "You don't even know him." Elena's expression grew thoughtful. "I've spent 20 years taking care of other people's children, watching families navigate loss and transition and new beginnings. I've learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is recognize when someone deserves a second chance, and then help create the circumstances that make that second chance possible." She stood up, leaving both folders on Victoria's desk. "Mr. Rivera is in Conference Room B conducting his preliminary assessment. Harrison Morrison is in his office, waiting for your call to finalize the original acquisition agreement. And somewhere in this city, 2 little girls are getting ready for school, unaware that their entire future might depend on decisions made in the next few hours." Elena moved toward the door, then paused. "I'll be at Morrison Healthcare for the rest of the day if you decide you want to discuss the partnership option further. But either way, Miss Chen, you now have all the information you need to make whatever choice feels right to you." After Elena left, Victoria sat alone in her office, staring at the folders spread across her desk and thinking about the conversation that had begun with a dropped phone. and somehow evolved into a crossroads that could change multiple lives forever. Through the glass partition, she could see Marcus working steadily at his computer, his concentration total, and his posture reflecting the kind of professional focus she'd learned to recognize and value. Victoria opened the first folder again, reviewing Elena's medical report about Harrison Morrison's diagnosis. She thought about her own father, who'd built a small accounting firm from nothing, and had worked until the day he died to ensure his family was financially secure. She understood the desperation that came with facing mortality while worrying about the people you'd leave behind. Then she opened the second folder, studying the cybersecurity reports that confirmed every concern Marcus had raised and several he hadn't even mentioned yet. The data was damning, but it was also complete and actionable. With this information, she could either walk away from Morrison Healthcare entirely, or structure an acquisition that addressed the problems while protecting her company's interests. Victoria picked up her phone and dialed Marcus's extension in the conference room. "How's the assessment going?" "Better than I hoped and worse than I feared," Marcus replied. "I've found enough public information to confirm that Morrison Healthcare has serious infrastructure vulnerabilities, but I'll need access to internal systems to determine the full scope of the problems." Victoria took a deep breath. "Come to my office. I think I can help with that." When Marcus entered her office 10 minutes later, Victoria gestured for him to take a seat and then pushed both of Elena's folders across the desk toward him. A woman named Elena Rodriguez was just here. She works for Harrison Morrison, and she brought information I think you need to see. Marcus opened the first folder, his expression growing increasingly serious as he read through Harrison Morrison's medical diagnosis and prognosis. When he moved to the second folder containing the cybersecurity reports, Victoria watched his professional demeanor shift into something harder and more focused. "This is comprehensive," he said finally, "and it's worse than I suspected. Morrison Healthcare isn't just vulnerable to cyber attacks. Their systems are so outdated that they're probably violating federal healthcare data protection regulations right now." Victoria nodded. Elena Rodriguez suggested a solution that would address the infrastructure problems while protecting Morrison's family and giving you a permanent position with my company. She outlined Elena's partnership proposal, watching Marcus's expression change from skepticism to cautious interest to something that looked almost like hope. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You're offering me a job," he said slowly. "A real job with a salary and responsibilities and the chance to use the skills I've been keeping sharp in library computer labs for the past 18 months. I'm offering you the chance to help solve a complex problem while rebuilding your career," Victoria corrected. "But yes, it's a real job with real expectations and real compensation." Marcus looked down at the medical report. "Harrison Morrison is dying." "Yes. And his daughters will inherit whatever we structure this deal to provide for them." "Yes." Marcus was quiet again, and Victoria could see him processing not just the business implications but the human ones. "In Afghanistan," he said eventually, "we had a saying about situations like this. When you can't save everyone, you save who you can. It looks like Elena Rodriguez is trying to save everyone." Victoria smiled. "What do you think about her chances?" Marcus looked across the desk at her, and Victoria saw something in his expression that reminded her why she'd gotten into business in the first place. Not for the money or the power or the recognition, but for the satisfaction of building something meaningful and the possibility of changing lives in the process. "I think," Marcus said, "that we should call Harrison Morrison and see if he's interested in a partnership instead of a sale." The next few hours passed in a blur of conference calls, contract negotiations, and strategic planning that challenged everything Victoria thought she knew about conducting business. Harrison Morrison, reached by phone at Elena's suggestion, listened to their partnership proposal with the careful attention of someone who'd built a successful company by recognizing opportunities that others might miss. "You're proposing to acquire my company while allowing me to retain an ownership stake that passes to my daughters," Harrison said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for the conversations that mattered most. "And you want to hire a homeless veteran as your cybersecurity director to oversee infrastructure improvements that will cost millions of dollars." "That's a fair summary," Victoria replied, though she noticed that Harrison's characterization of Marcus as a homeless veteran didn't capture the full complexity of his qualifications or his potential value to the organization. "Ms. Chen," Harrison continued. 6 months ago, when I first learned about my diagnosis, I thought my only options were to sell quickly before anyone discovered our infrastructure problems, or to hold on until I died and leave my daughters to deal with a company that might not survive the next major cyber attack. Victoria heard the exhaustion in his voice, the weight of carrying secrets that affected not just his business but his family's future. And now? Now you're offering me a third option. The chance to see my company stabilized and integrated into an organization with the resources to address our challenges, while ensuring that my daughters benefit from its long-term success rather than just its immediate sale value. There was a pause, and Victoria could hear papers shuffling in the background. Elena told me about your conversation with Mr. Rivera, about how he returned your phone and then provided insights that your own due diligence team had missed. She also told me that he's been living on the streets despite having cybersecurity expertise that could be invaluable to any major corporation. Victoria glanced at Marcus, who was listening to the conversation with the kind of focused attention she'd learned to associate with people who understood that their lives could change based on words spoken in the next few minutes. Mr. Morrison. Victoria said, I believe Marcus Rivera could be instrumental in addressing Morrison Healthcare's infrastructure challenges while strengthening my company's own cybersecurity protocols. But I also believe that this partnership arrangement would benefit everyone involved more than a traditional acquisition. Harrison was quiet for a moment. I'd like to meet Mr. Rivera before we finalize any agreements. Would it be possible for both of you to come to my office this afternoon? Victoria looked at Marcus, who nodded without hesitation. We'll be there at 2 o'clock. After the call ended, Victoria and Marcus spent the remaining morning hours reviewing the partnership structure in detail, identifying potential challenges and developing contingency plans for the most likely complications. Victoria was impressed by Marcus's ability to think strategically about complex business arrangements while maintaining focus on the human elements that traditional corporate analysis often overlooked. Harrison Morrison built his company from nothing, Marcus observed as they prepared to leave for the meeting. He understands what it's like to bet everything on your own abilities and to worry about what happens to the people you care about if you fail. Victoria nodded. Elena Rodriguez has been managing his family's personal needs while he's been trying to save his professional legacy. She understands what it's like to see potential that other people miss. And you, Marcus said, looking at her with an expression that was both grateful and challenging. You understand what it's like to take risks on people when conventional wisdom suggests you should play it safe. Victoria considered this as they rode the elevator down to the lobby. Maybe, she said, or maybe I've just learned that conventional wisdom doesn't always account for the most important variables. The Morrison Healthcare offices occupied 3 floors of a modern glass building in Midtown Manhattan, with the kind of understated elegance that suggested success without ostentation. Elena Rodriguez met them in the lobby, greeting Victoria with the familiarity of their morning conversation and extending her hand to Marcus with genuine warmth. Mr. Rivera, she said, I've heard impressive things about your assessment of our infrastructure challenges. Marcus shook her hand, studying her face with the careful attention of someone trained to read people quickly and accurately. Miss Rodriguez, I understand you've taken considerable personal risk to arrange this meeting. I appreciate your confidence in a partnership approach. Elena smiled. I've learned that sometimes the biggest risk is not taking one when the opportunity for positive change presents itself. She led them to a conference room on the executive floor, where Harrison Morrison was waiting with the kind of patient stillness that Victoria associated with people who'd learned to conserve energy for the moments that mattered most. He was perhaps 60 years old, with graying hair and the lean build of someone whose illness hadn't yet claimed his essential vitality. But Victoria could see the effort it took for him to project strength, the careful way he moved that suggested pain managed rather than absent. Ms. Chen, Harrison said, rising to greet her with a firm handshake. Thank you for considering an alternative to our original agreement. He turned to Marcus, his eyes sharp with the assessment skills that had built his company. Mr. Rivera, Elena tells me you identified security vulnerabilities that my own team missed. Marcus met his gaze steadily. Sometimes an outside perspective reveals problems that internal familiarity obscures. Harrison nodded slowly. Let's discuss how we can turn those problems into solutions that benefit everyone involved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.